If, has there ever been water extracted for drinking purposes here in that area?
No,
No.
no.
Yeah.
In fact, what has happened over the years, I think originally, when we found out the contamination and the nature of the contamination, the village still had a municipal system around there, well number 3, 4, 5, and then later on 6. And those were never really impacted. And eventually, UTC actually paid part of the relocation of the system away from here.
You also said that you couldn't use that for residential purposes in the foreseeable future. What about any other purpose, park, anything?
Right now, the plan calls for limiting the use of that facility to commercial industrial. That is not to say if the municipality would like to see it used as, I know it's referenced as green space, if you want to extend the park, for example. What we would need to do then is look at the risks associated with children playing in a park, the adults that will be there, so that we can assure ourselves that that particular use is acceptable. So in other words, until we have all of the information, the data to support a use, we're going to limit it to the use that we do know it's acceptable for right now, which is commercial industrial.
Wouldn't that put people more at risk than a park? I mean, you're gonna have people in there, I assume, 8 hours a day or more.
Right
And
now,
so,
go ahead.
park, they're there maybe for a couple hours and they're home. It's all out in the air and everything's fine.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, I think what he's asking is the exposure for a park, because there's a limited duration, less than somebody in a commercial industrial
That's
site.
true, yeah, you're exactly right. The risk assessment's done primarily in 2 parts. Exposure, how much of the different contaminated media you're exposed to. We usually looked at ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact, and how long. So your example of a recreational scenario, they're only out there maybe a couple times a week, say most during the summer, versus commercial, which is counted on for 250 days a year for 35 years.
Will there be barriers within an industrial complex or commercial?
We think that's based on two approaches or 2 scenarios. One is residential, which is we look at for all of our cases, and then we look at one for commercial industrial. Currently, there's two media that are really a concern. One's the soil, one's the groundwater. For the soil, the only areas that exceed currently the cleanup values are either under the slab or back in the area where the active remediation is going, back where inside the fenced area. So they're not really available for exposure at this point. And the preferred plan discusses the building and those types of things in the slab in this case now, to basically prevent exposure to the soil.
Yes.
So then, the other part of it is the cleanup for the groundwater, and that's based on either potable use, which is ingestion, which has been taken care of through either use restriction, or eventually the cleanup goal we have based on being able to return the groundwater to a usable concentration to where it would be acceptable for potable use. And then we also have a cleanup value based on vapor intrusion, which is either groundwater or soil, and has these VOCs, volatile organic compounds in it, that volatilize up through the soil and get into people's buildings, either homes or, in this case, would be businesses. So one of the cleanup goals that we have cited in the preferred plan would be protective of commercial uses. And we're going to monitor until that reaches those cleanup goals. But currently, the site itself, where the highest levels of contamination are, they're not meeting those goals apparently. And so there'd be a prohibition against building something that wouldn't be protected there. I don't know if that answered your question or.
I don't know either.
Anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir.
We've been at the soil vapor extraction process for It would take 10 years or more now.
Since '01.
And based on the removals that you've seen so far, what do you forecast is the length of time that the soil vapor extraction process and whatever is going to have to continue before the site is cleaned up?
Actually, I think Tim and I have been doing that mathematics for a while here. And I think our best estimate is we'll see something in the next 8-9 years.
I'd say at least that long.
Yeah,
About 9 million?
yeah.
Yeah, these systems unfortunately do tend to have a diminishing return on time. So we saw an awful lot of cleanup in the first few years. And then as it becomes cleaner, you're chasing something that's not quite as contaminated in the ground. And so it takes longer to clean it up. But the last, the final 10% is going to take longer than the first 10% for getting rid of contamination.
And right now, I think we have between 35 to 5,000 pounds removed. That's quite a bit.
Yeah, this system has pulled a few tons of contaminant out of the soil underneath in this area.
And the chemical oxidation actually did a good job because if you look at the soil contamination and look at the numbers we were getting before the chemical oxidation, you'll be surprised how the reduction went. It really went down in the soil.
I think I saw a hand back here.
How far down have you checked to the southeast as to what the contamination level is? And I know some of the buildings across the street, you have like an air sparking system underneath the floors in the building. But how long will it be before we have to put one into this building?
Say that again, please. How long? will-
Because some of the businesses across the street, you channeled underneath the floors
Yes.
and put in like that air system you was
Right.
talking about. Being how this building is pretty close to those buildings there, have you guys done any checks down in this area to make sure that contamination is not down here?
And we're pretty sure it's not down to this extent.
Well, with the water flow and the aquifer flowing this way,
No,
it
this
doesn't
is
get
where
down
it
to this
flows.
area.
We've sampled the whole way to the Clear Fork Creek branch.
The flow direction is this way.
Right. Right.
And
But seeing how we're on this side of the river, has it crossed the river at all?
No.
no,
So basically it's staying on this side of the river down through here, right?
initially we sampled the river, we had the creek, Clear Fork, we sampled it, and there was no detection.
Was there any detections in this area here?
No, because we don't have any monitoring wells here, but we are confident there is none. So we never put in one. We know, how do we know that? Because when you look at some of the wells around here, you can see it's really very low numbers as you go here.
Okay.
Compared to what you have here is very, very.
But your air spurging system's pulling back against the water flow that's always going this way. So you're only gonna be able to suck so much, right?
The air spurging system doesn't pull the groundwater. It injects air into the groundwater, agitates the groundwater and sucks up the contamination.
Yeah, basically it'll be a recovery system, right?
Yep.
I think the question, Edward, might be, so that's the map delineates sort of the extent of the plume.
This is the extent.
So that's sort of the edge of where it falls off almost to non-detect. And then the plume is in steady
Do
state.
you remember what the
stable.
concentrations are here?
Well, my lines there are the 5 parts per billion.
Yeah, they are very low numbers.
And Tim, is the plume stable? It's not growing or shrinking?
I think it is shrinking, it's certainly not growing.
It's not growing.
I think to answer your question, your concern was, would there be a circumstance at which point in time a down gradient property that is not necessarily affected now
Right.
will be affected?
Right.
The answer is, if you look at the most down gradient line, my understanding is that data point represents a concentration that is acceptable for potable use. So you could drink it. So in other words, anything that migrated further than that is even less than the acceptable drinking water standard. So it would be safe.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Are these two methods, in my basic understanding too, they seem to be sort of the same thing, except one's used to pump air and pump, are they the cheapest methods?
Which methods?
You guys proposed the soil vapor extraction and the air sparging.
Oh,
Are
they're
these-
not cheap at all.
I didn't say they were cheap. Are
Oh.
these the cheapest of your alternatives?
I would call them the most cost-effective.
Please, the cheapest, I would say,
Outside of no action, I think I
Okay.
understand that.
digging a trench and enclosing iron in it may be also cheaper. But how effective would that be? That's number 3, I believe, for groundwater.
Okay.
The best way to answer your question is that while they are the most technically feasible, they are the least expensive, but the reason they're the least expensive is because there's no capitalization cost to put it in. If we were to look at those other remediation techniques, we have to start from ground zero putting them in. There's a huge, huge cost to putting something in, whereas at this point, we're maintaining a system as opposed to that capitalization cost.
So if there were other options that were more cost effective, would you guys implement those? I mean, cost is obviously important, but if there were other feasible, more cheaper options, would you look at those alternatives?
We would look at them to the extent that one of the, if you can kind of remember the slides earlier, there are basically 9 criteria that we need to look at. So whether we can implement it, whether it is cost effective, but it has to be able to treat to a certain level as well, you need community acceptance, and it needs to meet our regulatory standards. In other words, it needs to comply with the law. So basically it doesn't matter what the technique is, every technique we evaluate will be evaluated versus those 9 criteria.
And one thing I can say about cost at this site, everybody that has been involved, and Tim and I, probably over 20 years doing this on this site, cost has never been a problem here. We have never had a site in Ohio where this much money was spent on an interim action. I think it took about 18 months to install over 600 wells. That's how long it took just to install that many wells, in addition to monitoring wells. At one point, we had over 200 monitoring wells in addition to sparging wells. And so you have over 800 on 9 acres. That's a lot.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
My name's Mike Gibson. I'm a hydrogeologist with Eaton & Associates out of Columbus, Ohio, consultant for the village of Lexington. I wanted to touch on a couple points well, several points, one of which Tim talked about in response to a question on the southern end of the property. There's an area, if we talk about control and whether or not we know what risks are off-site to nearby residences, there's a monitoring well location, MW5S, which is a shallow water well that's on the southeastern corner of the Hamilton Standard property. Since 2004, when the pump and treat wells were shut down, there's been a gradual increase in concentrations in that well, TCE in particular, also PCE. We see now concentrations that range in the range of 89, 96 are the most recent values. As we look at that's the southeasternmost extent control that we have of any information about the extent of the plume in that direction. We don't know what's further south of there. The concentration at that well, which is about 50, 60 feet off of the nearest residential parcel at 89 to 96 is approximately 5 times the remediation level presented in the preferred plan as the highest level below which indoor air risks should be nominal. So we're 5 times above that, 50 to 60 feet off the property with no control to the south. How do we know that those parcels to the south, indoor air, basements or subslab, whatever they are, that are in the immediate vicinity of that well are not impacted by similar concentrations above standards where there may be now an open pathway for exposure that has not been addressed? I would suggest we do not have control of potential exposure particularly in that southeast corner. I would also suggest that all areas where you have shallow concentrations above remediation levels, there's no remedy in the plan to address those during the interim. They were addressed evidently, through the interim action that you described for the offsite properties with subslab mitigation. I don't think that interim action or any other effort to address those shallow concentrations is presented in the plan. They're referred to almost in past tense. They're not a requirement of the plan for there or for the properties to the south, in this case, that might be affected near NW5S.
I have to ask you the second part of that again. As far as the properties immediately to the south go, if you go back to the original remedial investigation report, there were borings done in 1999 along the southern boundary of the property. This was before anything was done to clean it up. And soil gas samples collected. The concentrations were such, they were very low, and when you figure the transport and the process to get to any of those houses, it's essentially a negligible risk. Let me restate that. On the property, right at the boundary, the southern side of the plant, the soil gas concentrations there were very low. And I'm talking about things that may be like 3 feet below the surface. And that's not going to migrate. By the time that migrated, if it could migrate, down to those houses and got through the floor, you're basically talking something which is immeasurably small. Now, again, that was before we treated it. The MW5 well is in the property itself. The actual building itself, that footprint, has got some contamination under it. Nobody denies that point. And that's why there will be careful evaluation of any restrictions that are kept on it for any future use of that property. The obvious thing is we're not going to allow residences on it. But underneath the property itself, there is contamination. Everybody knows that. We see no evidence that it's migrated to the area either through a gas phase or through volatilization off of the groundwater that it's migrated into those houses south of the property. We see no indication of that from any of the data we've got.
What was the date of that soil gas investigation?
The date?
99.
And where's that? In that area?
Yeah, it was in the remedial investigation.
Right. What about was there off-site vapor investigation done on any of the surrounding properties at some point? Was it health department or?
There were, and some of the properties, I can't remember the year now, but that was before this system was installed. That's before any remedial action was taken. I think mostly on this area it was done. That was a long time ago. Some indoor air, I believe, was done.
Right. In February of 1999, the TCE concentration in MW5S was 5.1. That's micrograms per liter. The latest data show that concentration is in the 90 range. Conditions have changed down in that area. We don't have control, we don't see control, you don't present any control that shows what the extent of that change has been in the southern reach. Your plan says if it's above 18, it poses risk to indoor air. We don't know what the shallow concentration is beyond that increasing trend that we see in that southeast corner. You have properties that are 50 feet away, buildings that are 100 feet away, 150 feet away max. And we don't have any control for that. It seems to me that that's a missing link, a missing point that's not addressed. I'll leave that at that. I have a couple additional comments.
Sir, you feel free to ask your questions, but do you want to make these points on the record?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we're not on the record right now. We're still in the Q&A, so I just wanted to.
I understand. I
Okay.
want to try to get some of these questions
Okay.
addressed. Since we had some facts come up with Tim, it's hard to let those sit. And I'm happy to sit back if you'd like to continue.
I just wanted to make sure that you understood we weren't on the record, because I
No, I understand.
didn't want to make you repeat yourself when we get into the public.
Yeah.
If you have questions,
Totally
you can
understand.
answer them.
Yeah, we're also aware of the comment.
Okay.
Okay. Edward, could you point to where wells 3 and 4 are relative to the plume, where they were historically?
Which one?
The village wells?
don't recall exactly.
I can't see from here,
Decommission for
they're
years.
along the lane to the treatment plant.
I could point them out.
Yeah, that's been decommissioned a long time ago.
Right.
I don't remember the location, exact location. I can't point it out, but I remember they were there and they were decommissioned.
Right, those
Maybe-
wells, one of those wells was never really a good functioning well. I always forget which one.
I think it's number 4.
Right, and then 3 ended up having diminishing returns, a lot of fouling
Correct.
issues. There's not a lot of data, and I think, as I recall, wells 5 and 6 came on in the 94, Chuck, 95 timeframe.
Yeah, that's been a long, I can't remember from 90s.
Was there much data collected from those wells, really in the early stages of the investigation around the Hamilton Standard facility to
When,
see what was there in terms of PCTC concentration, for example?
well, when the initial investigation started in '87 by our surface water people, which remediation is not really what they did. The Ohio EPA did not have a remediation division
Right.
until '88. When they started, they were collecting water samples. They never, I don't think they really analyzed what they were collecting. They were filing them away. But there are samples from the '80s. Somebody has to go look for them. But the records show they collected samples from the '80s.
Does anybody else have any questions before we move to the public hearing? Yes, sir.
With regard to the areas, the off-site areas where the groundwater contamination has spread, are you recommending any use restrictions in those areas?
That would be a recommendation, Mark. He's the lawyer, he probably will have.
Yes. Yeah, there's, one of the slides that Edward showed listed 3 use restrictions that are suggested in the preferred plan. The first is a general groundwater prohibition. The second is a building occupancy prohibition. And then the third is a commercial industrial land use restriction. So that would be documented in an environmental covenant that would have to be agreed to by those property owners. So it's important for us to get input, from the public and from those property owners at this stage to make sure that that is a feasible option for the property owners involved.
But those would be your recommendations for both the site itself and those off-site areas?
Right, we have a recommendation that there be activity and use limitations, or if you will, restrictions on the use of both the Hamilton Standard Controls property and the off-site property owners, the 3 properties that are impacted across the road there.
Sir, before I call on you, I just want to see if there's anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to ask a question, if anybody has any other questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is there any advantage or disadvantage to demoing the slab on the property? Is that just a,
Well, right now, the slab assures that nobody's gonna get their feet in any contaminated soil that's underneath.
so it should remain in place probably?
Well, again, it serves as a control to prevent that route of contamination. As to future use, or whatever happens in the future, we have to see what's proposed and what's evaluated. I mean, obviously, it's not acceptable as a remedy that anybody can be exposed to contaminated soil. So something would have to be there to act as barrier. That slab or something else.
Yes, sir.
It was mentioned that you tested the river in the beginning. Has there been any testing of the river lately to see if can this reach the river?
What we have never seen impact on the river. We've sampled water from the river. We can't get detectable levels of anything that's in that that we know is in the plume. We've also had our fish sampling team that examines the biological integrity of the river tested, and it really meets the highest level of compliance as far as health for the fish and the aquatic species in there goes. But the river is clean, I mean, from a biological standpoint. And I think we've done several sampling events over the years, as I recall. And again, there's no reason to think it's getting worse because their concentrations in the plume are decreasing. But the testing of fish species, the number of fish, their health, their different species, show that it meets its attainment standards under the Clean Water Act. In other words, we've got a healthy river out there. There's been no impact on it there.
Sir, did you have one more?
Quick question for Mark. Apparently, we're gonna have to live with that site being a cleanup site for at least the next 9, 10 years, or possibly longer. That site has become a community eyesore with the growth of tall weeds and vegetation and whatever on the property. Is there anything that can be done to require the current people that have control of that parcel to keep that property mowed and cleaned up?
Our primary concern is human health and the environment, those environmental impacts, not the aesthetic impacts. Nevertheless, we share your concern about the aesthetics, and it may be something that we can't require, but we could discuss with the property owner as we go forward and implement a remedy that includes property restrictions. It's perhaps something we could discuss with them and be sure that they're taking their responsibilities to this community seriously in terms of property maintenance.
I would hope that could happen.
One more question.
How can you say that, Mark? You put in the preferred plan. It's green space.
Well, green space, I think
Green space in there is wilderness.
Yes.
Archie Yolenzi spoke to this earlier tonight when he was asked about the eventual uses of that property. We've evaluated it.
I realize that, but you're calling it green space in the preferred plan. So
Right.
you've got to be able to say to the contaminator, you got to cover it up if we're going to make it green. Don't you? I mean, that only makes sense to me. But I'm just a farm boy. I mean, what the heck?
Again, I appreciate your concern about the impacts on the community, and we'll do what we can with the property owner to try to address it. But our concern is protection of human health and the environment.
I understand that, but you put it in the plan. You've got to be able to enforce it if you're gonna put it in the plan. And you're telling me, well, we can't force them to do it, that's been the problem for 30 years.
No, all I said was that, I meant to say is that it's not our task to require the property owner to cut weeds on the property. That's not an impact to human health and the environment, that's an
I'm not talking about weeds. You
the
know,
question was asked.
he's not talking about, we're talking about, yeah, the weeds are there because there's nothing there to grow. It's a concrete slab. It can't be a green space and be a concrete slab.
Should the property be fenced off? I mean, if you don't want footprints in the soil?
A portion of the property is fenced off. It's part on the back, what I would describe as the back of the property, where the soil vapor extraction system is operating. And so that continues to be fenced off. The concern from a human health standpoint, though, that I think is being raised here is there a need for that foundation to remain? And again, Archie commented on this earlier, it depends on the proposed use, future use of the property. If it's going to be used for commercial industrial purposes, and that foundation can be used for that purpose, then from a human health standpoint, we may be able to find that that's acceptable. But we need to know what that future use is, and then tailor our land use restrictions accordingly. All right, so if the eventual use of the property is not for commercial industrial purposes, then there's a desire to convert it to a park. And then, as Archie mentioned, we have to be able to be sure that when that foundation is removed, there is no risk to human health and the environment from exposure of recreational use to those soils. And right now, we think that may well be the case because our concern is primarily groundwater, not soil contamination, but that's something that we have to evaluate if the property owner decided to remove that slab. That's a conversation we have with the property owner in order to determine what restrictions would be necessary if that concrete slab were removed. And I suspect we'll have that discussion with the property owner when we get to the point of implementing this remedy.
Yes, sir.
So I had a question. It looks like you're consistently applying the same technique across the entire site, whether it's
there or down gradient, is there any benefit, or have you considered the benefit of aggressive remediation at the site to reduce the source first before it goes down gradient?
Well, that has been done, and that's what the chemical oxidation did, was to suppress the source by chemical injecting permanganate into the formation, soil formation. So that's been done already. But the problem of doing that is it works best when it's a high permeability soil. What we have left after it's been removed from soil that is mostly sandy or silty, we have clay, and some of the clay materials have embedded in them some of the chemicals. Chemical oxidation doesn't quite work well.
So extraction is not an option for those high concentration areas?
It's not going to be very effective this time around. It's been done 2 or 3 times already.
We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to move into the public hearing, and any questions that weren't answered, ask them on the record, and we'll go ahead and respond.
What's the depth of the contamination underneath the soil?
Very good.
What did you say?
That's the contamination under the slab.
I think it gets close to about, or in the soil?
Yeah, in the soil, underneath the slab itself.
Well, obviously, it's gone through the water table, about 18, something like that, feet.
18 feet?
It's gone down to the water table, that's
Yeah.
probably 18 or 20 feet.
Yeah.
These chemicals are heavy and they sink under the force of gravity. And gravity will pull them down towards groundwater.
Wouldn't it be more feasible, 18 feet, I know it's gonna be a big hole, just bust that slab out and take all that contamination out? Because you do that with underground fuel tanks, you clean up the whole entire mess underneath it. Some of them you go down double deep, you dig it out.
Well, the extraction system they have now can more effectively do it. What you're saying will be quicker to do, but you have to find a landfill that will accept hazardous waste. And that's not cheap at all. It's very expensive to dispose of hazardous waste soil.
The other thing you have to remember is that for most of the time we've been working on this site, there was at least some serious hope that that building could be redeveloped. So we didn't want to blast our way down through the floor and dig a big hole where the building was. At least when we started, there was still some idea of reuse of the building. So we wanted to preserve that as best as could be done.
And now the building's gone, we got a slab that,
It's gone now, yes.
I mean, it's got some dangerous spots on it. Somebody gets out with a bicycle, that's some bad spots. Is there a possibility that you can get a hold of the landowner and have them top fill it, maybe 3 or 4 feet deep, to make it back into that green space that you got proposed? Because you can't plant corn on top of concrete.
Well, that's certainly something we need to be evaluated and considered, yes. And long-term use of the land, yes.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We're going to